Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Commissioner Randolph. We'll just dig in deep since you both broached the subject of governance. And I know that as the president of the PUC, you want to move the commission towards a new policy governance framework. That's your goal. Commissioner Randolph, are the chair of the subcommittee on policy and governance right there. I don't know if those are germane per se or that's other governance issues. Because you want to move towards a new policy governance framework, a new governance framework, I should say, remove policy, a governance framework, why don't you give us your perspective? I'm curious to know why you want to move towards a new policy, I should say governance framework. What have you seen? What have you observed that requires in your mind these structural changes that have to take place in order to restore the public's confidence back in the PUC? And in fact, for that matter, I have no idea if the public had any confidence in the PUC to begin with since day one, but, I mean, things ebb and flow all the time, but why don't you give us your observations as to why you're leading towards these structural changes?
I think one reason is that things are not well documented at the PUC. It's always a measure of a poorly managed system if you can't find actual written processes and procedures. We do have a lot of rules that help us to define our proceedings. But there's a lot of things that we do at the PUC that aren't really contained within that formal process, with those specific rules that are administered by the administrative law judges. So, for example, we comment on FERC and FCC actions, and they're very significant. We've probably saved $1.5 billion for ratepayers in the last 10 years on commenting on transmission tariffs at FERC. But I couldn't find any policy that described what things we commented on at FERC and how people really decided what to participate in. I noted that there was a practice before I became president of actually running the filings past the president, but that doesn't seem like a very good way for an organization to actually set a direction and a set of policies. Many of the things we're doing are important, but it's not documented. That tends to lead towards inconsistent policies, lack of clarity, commissioners who are frustrated because they don't feel like they have a voice in what the organization that they're being held accountable for in terms of these major federal policies. So I wanted to make it more explicit and then to actually give the commissioners an opportunity wherever possible to actually say, yes, this is consistent with the policy of the organization, or no, this is not consistent. So that's one kind of a action. Two is that we tend to assign specific proceedings to different commissioners, and then when the similar proceeding comes up, then we'll give it to another commissioner. The chief ALJ, administrative law judge, will assign a judge to work on it, and you get these odd combinations. And the only way that we can have consistency is for people to look back and to read what it is that people have incorporated in past proceedings. That doesn't really set a good course to the future. It actually hinders progress because you're constantly referring to the past. We ought to have some discussions, for example, about where the PUC is going on issues of transportation safety. Set some direction and some policy. And then every commissioner and every law judge and all the staff will then be able to be held accountable to the general direction. Sometimes it'll be very broad. It may not actually satisfy all the questions. I don't think it should be intended to do that. But everybody then will be able to look and have some sense of where it is the PUC is going. I think that the lack of that means that there's a tendency for many staff then to try to guess and try to settle these questions for themselves, and then to actually push them into the proceedings rather than having that robust policy discussion with the public and between the commissioners. So that's another reason. And I think that without having that kind of that management and attention to detail across the organization, we'll always have the problem where some programs get more attention than others. They become more topical, they become more interesting, there's more public attention, and that's where people want to make their mark. Somehow or another, the commission has to hold itself accountable to all the things that we need to do that just aren't that much fun. It's probably one of the reasons why safety eroded over 20 years. So those are the kinds of challenges I think that we need to address. I think that there are many more fine-grained things that we also need to focus on. It gives us an opportunity to do things like a commissioner code of conduct, which Commissioner Randolph is working on. We, for the first time, have now a commissioner job description. When I got there, there was no job description. I had to interview my staff to find out what it is a commissioner does. And so all these reasons are why I think that we need to have that kind of governance structure. It makes it easier for other people to see what we're doing and to hold us accountable.
Mr. Speaker, on the issue, the number one thing that you brought up, the issue of documentation, or there's not good documentation for whatever reason, is that a reflection of the institution itself? We're talking about staff or governance or a combination thereof. Some of the critiques have been that does the dog wag the tail, or does the tail wag the dog with regards to commissioners come and go, as we know, as the appointments come and go through governors. Staff is institutionalized as well. Is this also a reflection of the issue of staff, the institution itself, or is it just all governance, which are all of you?
I think it's all of the above, but I'd be interested in Commissioner Randolph's thoughts on it too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly, I think past commissioners didn't see it as their responsibility to set that clear staff direction and accountability. For instance, workforce planning. The commission needs to pay attention to it and go, okay, we have some retirees that are coming up. A lot of state agencies are dealing with this, and instead of just sort of saying, oh yeah, the executive director will deal with that, paying attention to kind of fundamental organizational issues is part of our job description, and we as a group need to take ownership of that and ensure that we have an overall set of goals and metrics and direction for staff, so that when a new president comes in or a new commission comes in, there's very clear direction from the commissioners about what needs to happen during that time.
Okay. I want to stay with this issue with regards to the institution itself. Is it of your belief, and I surely don't want to put anything in your heads, that perhaps the culture, I don't know about the current culture, but the culture of the past ceded a tremendous amount of power to staff, where the vast majority of decision-making was taking place by staff? Or again, going back to the dog wag the tail, or does the tail wag the dog itself? Because I know who's in the crossfire. In the crossfire, right or wrong with the allegations, are not the staff members. They're the actual commissioners themselves who are in the crosshairs.
Well, that's the way it should be. I mean, to some extent, we are the public appointees in you confirm us because you have faith that we're going to do this well. If we don't, we need to be accountable. The challenge that I have is that for a long time, people didn't pay attention to the CPUC until things got to a tone or a tenor or a boiling point where something happened. People felt bruised. And so we're getting attention. And so this is, I think, part of the challenge and the response. We have very good people. The organization is not as good as they are. And so to some extent, it is a structural problem. It's a leadership problem. It can be characterized as a staff problem, but we're responsible for actually reshaping that. So I think that this is our effort to try to do that. I think it will be successful. I think that it's succeeded already in getting the commissioners to talk to each other. I sense that the staff is actually paying attention to the things we talk about, and it's actually starting to spread into a more collegial set of deliberations on the policy issues. So I'll point to a couple of the unanimous votes that we had on major proceedings, including San Bruno, and then more recently the rate restructuring. And that didn't come just because the staff actually picked a lot of good policies and put them together. The commissioners deliberated together.
So
we talked to each other. And so I think
you talk to each other, actually.
We talked to each other. And I think staff is now starting to see when they get that kind of consensus, they're starting to see that this is serious and maybe this change is enduring. But for me, culture is more than just tone. It is very concretely, what is it that you do as an organization? How do you do it? And if you can't document that, and everybody can't walk in, see it, and understand it like everybody else, then you don't have a unified culture. Then you have people who take the wrong kind of initiative rather than saying, I know where we're going, I know where I'm supposed to go without having to check in. If I go further than that or to the side of that, I better check in. We don't have that.
One of the other things that we have really been trying to do is try to get the staff to not think of themselves as independent divisions within the commission offices, but to be working together as a staff towards the same goals. And it's important for us to set the direction that we are paying attention to all the divisions. As President Picker mentioned, over the years there were certain divisions that got less resources than others, got less attention than others, and we're trying to rectify that and make sure that we are setting a consistent direction for all of the divisions and making sure they all understand that they are all very valued and that their work at the staff level is critical to the success of the entire organization.
So what I'm hearing, if this is the right extrapolation, hopefully it's not full conjecture, is that we have an institution, or perhaps it's an institution that there's a recognition that we have an institution that's disjointed and that has culturally worked in a very siloed manner, whether it was staff, their own divisions from within the organization, which is reflective of private sector, public sector, and so forth. And that it's everybody. It's not just the PUC, but the PUC makes very, very critical, important decisions, obviously. And you had a governance structure that in itself was disjointed, and folks simply, for whatever their own reasons, didn't speak to each other in a congenial manner or collaborative. Or you don't have to be congenial with each other, just collaborative. If you're united, you're united. If you're not, but you have strongly held views, you have strongly held views. But folks never really engage with each other. If I'm hearing correctly, this is a recognition of a disjointed culture, both governance level and staff level. And with the subcommittee that you chair on policy and governance, you're trying to change culture, which is always hard to change. You can change laws, you can change rules and regulations. Culture is also always much more challenging. So there is a recognition of this disjointed, siloed culture that exists at the PUC.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, all right. So we're gonna. I got.
I'll just say we do have a lot more work to do. Okay. I've talked about some of the things we've done, but there's a lot more.
I would imagine. So then, on that note, to implement your new governance framework of a few of the items that you articulated that need remediation, to say the least, what's your standard? What is your metric that you believe you're progressing and moving forward?
Well, I'll start with just to note, one of the initiatives that we're taking is, for the first time in many, many years, doing an organizational strategic plan. And one of the sort of the indications of our past silos was that many divisions had their own individual division strategic plan, but there was no organizational strategic plan. And so President Picker instituted a process of going ahead and sitting down and doing a full 12-month strategic plan that will allow us to set goals and metrics and ways to hold staff accountable for those goals and metrics. And so that will give us a roadmap that we can then continually come back to and make sure that we are achieving what we set out to achieve. And elaborate on that.
I mean, I think it's where we will actually now begin to move more quickly on some of the policy directions. I think that it will draw the staff in and make them part of the process. It'll give them specific tasks as the commissioners start to set some general direction. We'll assign them to owners, to task teams, who will then go develop and bring them back to us for discussion and then adoption. They'll always be subject to, of course, legislative change and adaptation, and it'll probably have to get refined in a formal process through our proceedings. But each of these will make sure that as we look across the organization, everybody's clear on what they have to do. I think there's another element to it that's been neglected. We don't have a real strategic staffing plan. We know that we don't have enough people or the right kinds of people to do even our traditional tasks. Rate making really depends on engineers who can go out and measure and price the kinds of infrastructure that needs to be built or maintained or replaced. And as you lose engineers in the Bay Area with its high cost of housing, it gets harder and harder and harder to replace them. We get lots of really good economists from UC Berkeley, but they're not so good at going out and looking at a map and trying to figure out how much pipeline or how much transmission it's going to take. We need lots of accountants. They're the people who know how to go through and do forensic surgery on a utilities books to look at how they're spending their money and match that to the spending plans that we approved, and to really start to think about what are the limits of what we can spend at any given time. Can't get them in the Bay Area labor markets anymore. We have to really start to think clearly, methodically, and constantly about who do we need to recruit? Who do we need to retain? How do we train? How do we train people? And what does the succession plan look like? None of that exists. And so I just cannot fathom an organization that is regulating utilities and dealing with shifts in technology and major shifts in policy that doesn't have that kind of a systematic process. And so we'll always fall short of everybody's expectations if we don't start to build that.
Why don't we take a quick shift here? I'm going to open up to questions and commentaries of the members, and we're going to come back to a deeper dive on some of the questions from me. Why don't we go with Senator Leyva?
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem. Good afternoon, President Picker and Commissioner Randolph. I want to thank both of you for the time you spent with me. I want to thank you for your honest and direct answers, and then just let you know that I have a real appreciation for the position you're in and really taking on an agency or a commission that in many ways is a real mess. I do have a couple questions. Mr. Picker, or President Picker, excuse me. When it comes to the safety of transmission lines and gas pipelines, you wrote in your background to our committee that we do not operate utilities. We assure that they are taking steps to consistently make for a safer system. So a question, and then another comment. The question is, how safe are these lines, and what kind of assurances can the general public have? When you answer that, think about a report that was completed by the PUC, by the Folsom-based Business Advantage Consulting, that found that PUC staff lacks the leadership and tools needed to make safety a priority. So hopefully that has changed or is changing.
I think it's fair to say that it is changing. There's two different kinds of transmission system, really. There's the big high tension lines that come from distant power plants to urban areas, the anywhere from 500 to 800 kV line. Some people draw the line at 230 kV. Some people do it at 115, depends on the utility, depends on the state. So the big ones, I think that the most important thing we need to do is protect the corridors. It's like anything else, as California's population grows, population and other infrastructure starts to move into those areas. That creates inevitable challenges. Some of it's safety, some of it's just the fact that it doesn't bring peace and serenity and good sight lines to people's neighborhoods. But if you don't protect them, and then developers and local governments who don't think much about that future expansion of the transmission system, you have those collisions. I think that most of the new transmission lines are actually, bulk transmission lines are pretty safe. The place personally that I think we will focus more and more is in the low voltage systems that goes through high density residential areas. They are especially a problem because federal law actually requires utilities who have poles to allow other utilities to place their equipment on them. So you get conflicting technologies, you get overloading of poles, you need to actually inspect them more often to make sure they're not brittle or getting worm infestations. You need to make sure that say when a cable bundle gets abandoned as somebody moves to a new technology to get their TV and internet, that it doesn't just get coiled up there so that in a wind it'll whip around and actually impact the high tension wire. That's common, and it's becoming more common as we start to see this common use of the pole utilities. It's hard for us sometimes to figure out exactly who's responsible after the fact, so that means that we're going to have to get better at it going out and inspecting. This is going to be a huge challenge for us because, frankly, we probably should be using technology rather than having staff go out and look at poles every day and try to figure out what's going on. There's no reason why you can't do that with drones and good optical sensing technologies, except that the PUC does not have the pipelines to accept big databases, doesn't have the managers to actually manage big databases, and then we don't have statisticians to tell us where we should be sampling this. So this is part of, I think, what we'll start to get at when we're doing strategic planning. But I do think that those are some of the issues that we're going to have to wrestle with to really make sure our transmission lines are safe and reliable.